The Talk Station presents Faith Matters, a look at contemporary stories and issues from a faith perspective. While this is a pre-recorded show, we are interested in your ideas, comments, and questions, and we urge you to email them to faithmatters@thetalkstation.com.
Give me faith, trust what you say, that you're good and your love is great. I'm broken inside, I give you my life.
And now on the Talk Station, Faith Matters.
And welcome to the program here on Faith Matters on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240. And I'm Ben Ball, and we are joined by a good group of people here today, of course. Robert Cornegie, Associate Pastor, Chapel by the Sea in Emerald Isle. Johnny Gainey, Pastor, Bayboro and Stonewall United Methodist Church. John LaPere, Missions Pastor, Cape Carteret Baptist. And Dr. Ron Monteperdo, Political Scientist from Carteret Community College. And good day, gentlemen. Everybody say hello.
Hello. Hi.
Everybody speak up at once. Robert, let me start with you here. You have sent out these articles that we are referring to today, and one is on something that has been followed, I think, even in the popular media pretty closely, is about Mars Hill, a megachurch that's in Seattle. Mark Driscoll has been the pastor there for, I forgot how many years, but it's been a long time.
It's been a long time.
And it has grown into a number of satellite campuses as well, and tens of thousands actually that worship through this Mars Hill conglomerate. But now tumbling down. And tell us a little bit about the background here.
Yeah, actually, this article is from Christianity Today, and it's out of their leadership journal, which is a publication they do for pastors.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a pretty good piece of journalism. It's written from a pastor's perspective to other pastors.
Mm-hmm.
So there's
Right.
some lessons that are drawn from this. This isn't to just the lay public. It's kind of some warning, red flags that goes wrong. And when a mega church goes wrong, goes bad. And this one is...
As it's entitled, The Painful Lessons of Mars Hill.
Yeah, so that's kind of the context, if you will, of the article, and it's editorial and a teaching opportunity. They're using this as a teaching opportunity. So, in essence, what happened was Mark Driscoll became a superstar of evangelicalism, Protestant evangelicalism, and his church, Mars Hill, had this incredible growth rate as he grew in the public eye. You know, he became a celebrity preacher, nationally known, wrote a number of books that were somewhat controversial and got him in the headlines, and he was later on, and just before the collapse, he was gone a lot of the time because he was out doing his celebrity thing.
Right.
And so it grew to 15 satellite churches around the central church, and they did DVD. They had a big screen. Every one of the churches had big screens, of course, and used video, and they just broadcast. And so when you went to these satellite churches, there was a pastor there, but he was not officially the shepherding pastor.
Right.
They weren't there to hear the word of God from him. Mm-hmm. People went to those churches, those satellite churches, and the main church to hear Mark Driscoll. And so what happened, Mark got into some controversy over a couple of issues, and we won't go into that, but and decided to step away. And just by the end of the year, Mars Hill Church, with all 15 satellite churches and all of that, will no longer exist. They have closed down the church.
He announced, what was it, back in August, I think it was.
Yeah, I think so.
That he was going to step away for a period of time, and that the church would kind of analyze itself and to do some self-reflection, and then perhaps reimagine his role and some other roles there too. And it ended up being with him resigning, and then the church deciding to disconnect all those campuses, right?
Correct.
Set them adrift.
That's right. On January the 1st, 2015, the existing Mars Hill Church organization will be dissolved. After the church lays its central structure to rest, its 15 local bodies will float alone, if possible. And many of those have decided to shut down. So thousands of Christian worship, it says, I'm just reading from the article, thousands of Christian worshipers gathered weekly across 4 states. Their churches boasting annual revenues of more than $30 million. Dissolving, done.
Right. Okay, let's talk a little bit about what are these lessons? What are the lessons that we learn? Because most of us serve obviously much smaller congregations, but we have congregations of various sizes that we either attend or serve. And John, let me start with you as a missions pastor. I mean, you reach out and you're looking into, as I guess hopefully we all are, at bringing other people into the church as well, but and serving outside the walls of the church. What lesson do you take from this?
There's probably several hundred you could take from it. I think as I looked through this article, it seemed to me that they really lost focus as to what a church is and why a church exists. And an awful lot, at least as this article points out anyway, an awful lot of the emphasis turned to bringing more revenue in.
Revenue, yeah. I dislike that word in the churches.
Yeah.
Talk about revenue.
And that's not what church is about. Church is about the proclamation of the gospel and encouraging people to live a life that brings honor and glory to God, and that encourages them to use their hands and their hearts and their voices in service. And I think if a church remains true to that, God will bring whatever resources are needed to accomplish that mission. And each church is shaped different. Each church is composed of different kinds of people with different gifts and talents.
And reaches people differently, too.
And reaches people differently. And, one of the things I firmly believe is that God will put in our churches the people that he wants that are needed to accomplish his mission for that body of believers. And that will change over time as churches grow, or the senior leadership has a vision to do something somewhere, somehow. If that's a godly thing, that church will get equipped to do it. But to get driven by attendance numbers, or as one of the campus pastors mentioned, getting pressure to increase the giving per seat. That's the emphasis on the wrong syllable. I mean, it's just wrong. So I think the core is, you preach the gospel, you teach faithfully, you encourage people, you practice the Great Commandment, and you participate in the Great Commission, and that's what church is all about. Johnny Gainey, when there's been a lot of discussion in the Methodist Church, and no doubt it has to have been influenced by churches like this, about business language being used often in the church, and there's been both encouragement and also critique of that within the Methodist Church. And I know even with our previous bishop, Bishop Gwynn, there was the urge to use like Good to Great as a model, as a book, and then there was some pushback from that as well.
I think that what I would have to add to this is that when we look at Scripture, first of all, we look at Matthew 23:12. And Jesus says clearly that whoever exalts him or herself is going to be humbled. And so I think what happens in this is there's a book called The Critical Journey, written by Hagberg and Gulich, depending on how you pronounce it. And in that, there's these phases of faith. And in that third phase, it's called the productive life, and it's the place where you become a pastor or whatever ministry you're going to be involved in your faith. You get really active in it, and then if you get in this phase, if you become caged in it, which is a negative thing, suddenly you are driven by what Andy Stanley talked about this past Sunday. I watched his sermon. He talked about knownness. We want to be known, and it's a constant appetite that's never fully fed. And so once we get caught up in the negative side of that productive life phase of our faith, if we are caged in it, suddenly that the driving force is being known more and more and more, and doing better than last week, and writing a book better than the last book, and doing a sermon better than the last sermon. And next thing you know, we are just living life to exalt ourselves. How do I get bigger? How do I get more known? How do I get more popular? How do I sell more books? And I think what happened with Mark is he got caught up in that feeling that I have to outdo my last record.
Mm-hmm.
And he struggled, and that's why he got caught up in things like plagiarism, and he became a real grump to be around. Some said he was kind of a bullish boss. Mm-hmm. It's what happens.
Yeah. Is it Ron? Is this from the lay perspective, from the pew? Is this a view that you see, or you see sometimes where churches get hung up?
We see it all too often. From my perspective, it's nothing more, nothing less than the impact of our culture upon all our institutions. On the one hand, when we start thinking in terms of profit and loss, good, bad, when you become sort of management objective oriented, that affects not only the way you think but the way you act. And you can't use the methods of Caesar to build the kingdom of God, and I think that's the issue.
We'll have more on that too coming up in a moment here on Faith Matters on the talk station FM 107 and AM 1240. Welcome back to Faith Matters on the talk station FM 107 and AM 1240. We've begun this morning's program talking about an article that's in a leadership journal from Christianity Today called The Painful Lessons of Mars Hill. What can we learn from the collapse of Mark Driscoll's church? And I'd like to kind of start with that subtitle right there too, saying Mark Driscoll's church. That would be one of the issues I think John LaPierre we would want to highlight as a place to take issue with, being a person's church.
Well, you're exactly right. I mean, it's Jesus' church, and we're called to serve in it, mm-hmm. and we have responsibility to Him, and we have responsibility to the congregation, and we have responsibility to ourselves in that process to be to model godly behavior. Now, can't speak for the other gentlemen in the room, but I get that wrong occasionally.
Yes, right.
But that just indicates that we're human, and to encourage others to step into the roles that God has gifted them for in the body of the church.
Yeah, and in the break, Johnny, you were kind of mentioning that in fairness to Mark. I mean, we need that some to Mark Driscoll here. That may be something that we need to take into account, that he maybe got caught up into that idea of leadership. And Ron?
As a layperson who's worshipped, in probably 7 countries in my life, one of the things I have noticed is that churches are not good to their pastors. They assign them responsibilities, or they take responsibility. There are certain sets of expectations. And then the pastors are left to do it pretty much on their own. And they may get support from the congregation. They may get support from their brother and sister pastors. They may do all of these things. But ultimately, I think they're being asked to do something that's really impossible, which is, is to model Jesus, to model Christ in all of his perfection, which by definition we human beings simply cannot do. And the dangers there are very difficult, because pastors tend to, in my view, observation, they tend to lack a support structure. I mean, a pastor ought to have some time away every year. He ought to be, or she ought to be, with somebody who's on a faith walk, who has something to offer. A pastor ought to be held, I think, responsible. Ought to be able to talk with somebody. There ought to be a place. But
pastor needs a pastor.
Yeah, pastor needs a pastor. But no, pastors are invincible. I mean, pastors are absolutely perfect. They are invincible. And it's a tragedy that this has happened to all those people who are worshiping him at Mars Hill. I guess it's my old refrain, Ben. You're being too hard on yourselves.
Robert, what do you think?
Yeah. Well, look, we're all susceptible to the syndrome of unregulated power. And I'm giving a little grace to our brother Driscoll. When you start having that kind of success, and I'm doing that in quotes,
air quotes here.
Yeah, in the marketplace, then it's going to be real easy to let that run away with you and start believing your own kind of propaganda. Yeah. So, he got caught in that trap. It's interesting. One of the gentlemen who quoted in the article said, "I've been in a mega church in Pennsylvania where the pastor was a gentle, loving, caring, godly leader. It was a big church that was as healthy as it could be because the pastor knew what he was doing in creating a culture of grace." Now, I would think Mark Driscoll would probably say, and in fact, I believe there's some references to it, that's the way it started.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't be surprised.
No, right.
That that was the intention. And that's you get into that and you start seeing this progress, this momentum going, and it starts getting a life of its own. And they went to the point of hiring a professional general manager, basically to keep this thing going. They called it their advancement. They called the front, and so everything was about supporting the front, which was basically kind of a military context of assaulting the darkness, piercing the darkness. And so here we go, theological terms about, or concepts about penetrating, the gates of hell shall not prevail, and all those war cries that we come out with in our process. And so, they thought they were doing evangelism. They thought they were expanding the kingdom of God. They thought, but they
may have,
and they may have. But what happens is the problem is that the ends do not justify the means. We keep forgetting that, and that with the goal of expansion is God's work. I mean, God does this. He builds His church. And so we have to often we have to step aside a little bit and let Him do that work rather than we using tactics that may not be.
I'd like to add something about the humility thing again, and that is that in Exodus 30, the priest, Aaron, and his sons were to use a basin to wash their hands and feet, and that was something they had to do throughout the ages, all generations. This priest. And the priest's sons were to wash their hands and feet. And then Jesus comes along, and we read later on, and he's in John, specifically, in chapter 13, he washes the other people's feet. Right. And so, and I think what happens in this is is when we get caught up in this lack of humility, we say, I'm going to wash my feet, and then people come along and go, no, let me wash them for you. And then you end up saying, hey, wash my feet.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Well, in other words, Christ gave us a model of servant leadership, and that's an example, a great example of that. But it also, and John, we're to model that for other people so that they also take on that role of servant leader.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you lead by example. Mm-hmm. I think you lead by what you do, and you model that. And that builds that into the life, into the culture. I guess the current buzzword is the DNA of the church.
Yeah, but so that your congregation also becomes those servant leaders.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Absolutely. And so in that light, though, I think maybe we could have hope for this church, that as it breaks apart, it actually develops that servant leadership mentality.
There have been some big lessons learned here. And people who were involved. They have a number. This is a long article, And it has a lot of quotes from some of the pastors that were in these satellite churches and how limited they were by that central church to actually do ministry. They weren't allowed to be the pastor. It all went back to the central thing. And so big lessons about, we talk about pastors, many church members want the pastor to be the top-down leader, making all the decisions, telling them what to do, when and where to do it, and all of that. But really the biblical model, of course, is not that. It's that we are to come, servant leadership is all about coming up from below and lifting up the gifts and the talents of the members. We call it, Ephesians calls it equipping and preparing the saints for the work of the ministry. And so the pastors are really the coaches, player coaches, who equip the saints to do the work of the ministry. And we've gotten a little backwards in that we think that the pastors are actually the team that goes on the field,
right?
And the congregants sit in the stands and root them on, cheer them on. When it's not that at all. The team that goes on the field are the members.
The congregation wants to see itself as recipients.
Yeah.
They're actually fellow players,
right?
They're fellow performers in the worship, and the only audience is God. And but that's what That's what gets forgotten.
Ron?
Well, we've been having this conversation without any clear notion of what our model of the church is, and I think that's a question that has to be answered. When these satellite, it's like stirring up an anthill, if you'll pardon that metaphor. These satellite churches thrown up in the air, they come down. And I'd like to see where they're going to be 3 months from now, whether they'll simply reconstruct what they had, but on a smaller scale. And I find an absence of discourse on what the nature of the church is. Is the proper word ecclesiology? It depends upon your model of what the church is, and that contains within it. I think it could contain within it the structures that would help pastors. Give pastors the support that they need, just because they're human beings, to do all the tasks that with such. I mean, I can solve the problem of Mars Hill in an instant, sure. But there's no structure in place to help that.
Is that particularly true because it is an independent organization?
Well, that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
If in my tradition, I have a lot of connection with the Catholic tradition. Mm-hmm. And in that tradition, the concept of formation is what is dominant. And formation is a very, very complex process it's understood, it never stops, and it's undertaken within certain parameters, and there are certain key points at which the individual, and it's available to everybody, not just clergy, is, I want to say, examined, but is forced to confront certain important life issues. And I think we see more of that. We see less of that in the Protestant tradition. Now, I hope I haven't offended anybody here, but what I'm getting at is the institution contains within it the capacity and the idea of the mission to nurture its leaders.
Okay, we're going to probably segue from that into what has been some of the fractures of even those institutions, too. Coming up next here on Faith Matters on the Talk Station. Welcome back to Faith Matters on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240. And reintroduce our panel here today. Robert Cornegay, Associate Pastor, Chapel by the Sea in Emerald Isle. Johnny Gainey, Pastor of Vayboro and Stonewall United Methodist Church. John LaPere, Missions Pastor with Cape Carteret Baptist Church. And Ron Monteperdo, Political Scientist with Carteret Community College. The next article we want to consider, I kind of segue from where we left off with Ron's comments in our last segment here, too, is an article that comes from the Huffington Post religion section. Archbishop Justin Welby on Anglican communion. His quote is, "There is a possibility we will not hold together." And this actually comes from the Religion News Service and reprinted in Huffington Post by Trevor Grundy. It begins from Canterbury, England, with this quote from the article. In a lengthy interview in the Times of London, Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, predicted that the Anglican communion might not hold together because of strong disagreements on the ordination of women and as bishops and full rights for LGBT people. The candid interview came at the end of Welby's visit to the 38 provinces, or country states, that make up the Anglican Communion. Welby said that although individual churches remain strong, resilient, and thriving, the differences among them remain profound. And Ron, you were talking kind of at the end of this last segment, too, about the tradition and structure of the churches. It's something that we could lean on sometimes to get through some of these issues. Is that still true, or are we seeing this Anglican tradition in difficulty?
I think we see the Anglican tradition in real heartbreaking difficulty. I emphasized the word heartbreaking difficulty. The Anglican communion is held together not by any, I don't quite know how to put it. The Archbishop of Canterbury really has no authority over any other bishop or any other church. He is first among equals.
Yeah, the article calls it the mother church, though.
Yeah,
so
it is
looked that way.
Yes, but traditionally, the Anglican, the Archbishop of Canterbury has spoken for the Anglican communion. But it's very Anglican in the sense that the lines are gray and they aren't sharp. And these issues, you've mentioned them, they're all extremely divisive. And the tradition by itself, I think, does not have the strength to embrace it all, to hold it all together. The feeling is that, no, we can't live with the other person. Mm-hmm. And this has been going on since the 1970s. If there's one thing Anglicans do is fight and argue.
But politely.
Well, yes,
but politely.
But that's that's been going on a lot longer than just the 70s.
Well,
but,
sure.
Yes, but Robert has a different perspective from an independent church. You bring a different perspective to this, I think.
Yeah, it's like it's fascinating, the mix that we have in here, because we have, the mother church concept. We have the Methodist.
The breakaway from the mother church.
Yeah, the breakaway from the mother church, the Methodist church. We have I think we're kind of from the same territory, although you're Southern Baptist. We're not affiliated with any denomination at Chapel by the Sea. However, we do count our roots back to the Anabaptist movement, which was a breakaway from the Catholic Church and had its own set of things. So we do have a tradition.
We all like to take our casseroles and go.
Yeah, that's right. We do have a tradition that goes beyond the front door of our church. It goes a little further back into that. So we kind of use that, if you will, set of biblical worldview values as our kind of grounding on it. But we do not have a magisterium like the Catholic Church, or a pope, or someone that speaks authoritatively for us. We trace back to, sort of the Christ as the head of the church. So, and I know, of course, the others do as well. But it's different. So when we see these kind of ecclesiastical political maneuverings that are going on within these larger mainline denominations, there's a point at which, you can sort of sit back and say, oh, well, thank the Lord. We're not having to go through those kind of things to work it out. But we have our own little issues within our faith.
And I'll contrast that with the discussions we were having about the Mark Driscoll's church,
exactly.
Because you are independent, you have that
we have that
danger.
Burden of independence. That's right. That's exactly right. So.
But Ron, again, that tradition that goes back, and even Johnny from the Wesleyan tradition, we look at tradition as part of our quadrilateral, as we call it, Scripture, Reason, Tradition, Experience. That tradition does play a role.
Yeah, and it does. And I think as we look back, I was watching N.T. Wright, Nicholas Thomas Wright, who is an Anglican. He was the Bishop of Durham. I don't know if he still is. But he was talking about this issue, and he says that from the very beginning, we look at Genesis and we see, if you look at the beginning of the Bible and the end of the Bible, both of them talk about these complementary things like heaven and earth. And God created male and female. God separated the skies from the seas. And so his concern is that changing the definition of a word can be dangerous, and then we end up in dangerous places where we think it sounds right, and we'll say, well, look at nature. You see this kind of thing happening in nature. Well, nature isn't necessarily the best example of that. We've seen some pretty horrific things in nature also.
It's fallen.
Well, we have creation is broken as well.
Yeah, so these are things to consider, and I don't think we should be so afraid to have the discussion. I think we have to have it. This is something that needs to be done, and people need to talk about it, but we need to do it in such a way that it's dispassionate and more respectful.
Because there has been discussion, even within the Methodist Church and the confessing movement and some other movements as well, as to whether or not over sexual issues, LGBT issues, so we will break away. We will end up having a split there too. So, Ron, I don't think the Anglican Church is alone in this discussion.
Oh, I think not at all. I'd like to say it does seem to lead the way sometimes.
That's not necessarily a good thing.
But
not the leadership you intended.
You guys are getting the press.
But I think how can I put this? That there's as if Mark were here, he would say there's a necessary tension between
That's right.
between on the one hand, the church is a community. On the other hand, it's composed of individuals, and there are autonomous individuals. And the notion of the autonomous individual responsible for his working out her own salvation, I think, is extremely it's very valid. Certainly, it's a truth. It's a truth.
It was powerful. Yes.
Yeah, and there's another truth, that says that salvation is really impossible absent the community, absent the church, and absent the structure. And we have two truths, and I don't know. The two of them have to work together. The danger of one truth is you get things like Mars Hill. The danger of the other truth is that you get clericalism, and it stifles human creativity and relationship with God. And which is why I think it's all we can do sometimes is simply to pray and try to organize ourselves in ways that anticipate that can see these things and provide guidance for our leaders.
And all of this is played out on a stage of public media. And John, that's always a object of great misunderstanding of what goes on in the church. Southern Baptists have been no exception to that, as to what the general public understands about your polity and the control of Southern Baptist Convention, supposedly, over the independent church.
You're exactly right. I often in conversation with fellow travelers from other faith practices, and they one of the frequent questions is, well, what does the Southern Baptist Convention tell you guys you ought to do about this? And my answer is real simple: nothing. The Southern Baptist churches cooperate together, and as a group of 40,000 plus churches, we sort of drive the convention as to where the convention ought to be leading us. And while we do have a common document called Baptist Faith and Practice Statement, the organization itself doesn't dictate policy to any church in kind of any way, shape, or form, other than, here's, if you want to be part of our convention, here's what we expect you to believe and practice. I think probably the best line in this whole article was from Ron Thomas, chairman of Reform, and he said, "The issue that's splitting us is not just sexuality," he added, "but it's how attached to the Bible's teachings do we intend to be." And I think that's the core that all denominations and all churches struggle with. And to me, I believe we want to be attached to what the Bible teaches, and that's what gives us assurance we're headed down the right path. And I think had that been the magnifying glass maybe that was used at Mars Hill continually, because it's an application that you have to apply continually, they may not have ended up where they're at now. I don't know where they would have ended up, but they may not have ended up in exactly this place. And so...
in other words, really, both of these lessons is a matter of coming back to a humble place.
That's right.
Right?
It's always that. It's always at the foot of the cross. Yeah. That's where we have to meet. That's where the unity has to be. And, there we can have different, ways in which we, the hermeneutics and, how we interpret the Bible and the epistemology and all that kind of stuff. But, when it comes down to it, it's submitting to the lordship of Christ.
I know I've said often to folks who, if you want to say that Calvary was on a hill, some people had to climb a cliff to get up that hill, and some people took an easy path. But it's still that's still where we meet, is right there. In these various ways that we discuss these things, we approach these obviously from other perspectives, and we see how culture influences that, and how popular press has influenced the story on Mars Hill, how it plays out the story of the Anglican Church or of any church's schism. And I think maybe that's a role that always needs to be discussed too, because we have to say how much of that press do we believe, or how much do we come back into our own understandings of our relationship with Christ. We'll have more to come in a moment here on Faith Matters on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240. Welcome back to Faith Matters on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240. And thank you for joining us here this morning. And we appreciate you spending some time with us. And if you would like to comment too, faithmatters@dtalkstation.com is our email address. Feel free to make some program suggestions there or comments, and we'll be happy to refer to them. Our guests today, Robert Carnegie from Chapel by the Sea, Johnny Gainey from Bayberry and Stonewall United Methodist Church, John LePere from Cape Carteret Baptist, and Dr. Ron Monteperdo from Carteret Community College. In our final segment today, we'll look at an article that comes from Christianity Today. It's also been in a lot of the news. It's about the potential execution in Texas of a mentally ill man. And this article says, court stops execution of mentally ill man, defended by many evangelicals. More than 50 evangelical leaders, often at odds, recently united, asking Texas to commute the death sentence of a mentally ill inmate who believes he is being persecuted for preaching the gospel. Scott Panetti's execution was scheduled for today. This morning, an appeals court delayed his death with just hours to spare. I'm not sure exactly when this was posted.
It was posted on December the 3rd.
Okay. Sean Claiborne, David Gushy, Lynn Hybels, John Hunter, Sam Rodriguez, Jay Seklow, and some other conservatives and progressives signed the letter, which states that Christians are called to protect the most vulnerable, and that Panetti, who has been diagnosed with schizophrenia since the 1970s and murdered his in-laws to get rid of the devil, quote, inside them, falls into that category. Robert, you had passed along this article, and it brings up a lot of concerns about the death penalty and its applicability to the mentally ill. Did you see has there been discussion in evangelical circles about this case?
Not that I'm aware of. Now, there have been, but I haven't been involved in those discussions. But I know that from, Russell Moore and some others have gotten involved in this and have been talking about this. And not so much, it depends on which group you're with. If you're on the more progressive Christianity side, you're going to bring in the bigger picture, which is the whole
consideration of death penalty at all.
Death penalty at all.
Right.
What I was responding to was the fact that this is, where does mental health, where do you draw that line on that? And we have procedures for this. Different states have different procedures. And, of course, Texas has a procedure for this. And they've gone through the procedures, and now they're at the point of they were going to execute him, but it was stayed. So it's going to be fascinating to see how this works out. And so some are trying to leverage this out to the bigger issue of
right.
whether we should be doing this or not in the first place.
Ron,
for anyone.
As a political scientist, Ron, is this something that has raised your interest as well? How our application of the death penalty is a state-by-state issue, but it has Supreme Court obviously has been involved in it as well.
Well, it's not really a very, nationally speaking, if you were to rank all the big issues, the death penalty is one of those perennials. It's always there. And occasionally when something like this comes up, focuses attention on it, and it rises for a while, and then it all kind of goes away. So from, as a political scientist, I don't really have much to say about it. As a human being, I hope that the state of Texas will not execute this man who apparently is just so sick that he doesn't know what he's doing. He doesn't know what it means to be executed. And the concept of punishment, to my mind, as I can glean it, has absolutely no. He doesn't know. It has no meaning in this particular case. That's separate and distinct from the question whether or not he should be punished.
Right.
But the question is, in this case, is the concept of punishment meaningful?
Yes.
And I don't think it is.
John, you have a thought on this one?
Well, I would agree that this is clearly a guy that doesn't deserve this type of punishment, but I think the broader issue is the death penalty period, and I probably break with a lot of my friends, and that I find it very difficult to support the death penalty in any form. Because if I'm pro-life,
right,
right. I don't know how I can say, well, I'm pro-life, except, in these two cases or these three cases. And so I have really, this has been a battle for me over the years to come to grips with it on a personal level. There's certainly a finality to it that precludes that individual from ever embracing Christ when you take his life, when the state takes his life this way. And I'm not so sure that we're not. I think earlier, some weeks ago, when we were talking about another issue, we were talking about a state solution and a church solution to the problem.
Right.
But for me, it would be very difficult to ever endorse a death penalty. And then, of course, that issue gets more complicated because you can easily then stumble into this whole just war kind of conversation that people have been having over the past decade and a half or so also. But I wouldn't condone putting this person to death, and I find it very difficult to think about it in terms for anybody else.
And this, just to kind of encapsulate that, this case seems a lot easier to make that decision on, I think, for a lot of people. Yeah. Again, that's why Robert, I guess, is so-called evangelicals who disagree are coming together.
In fact,
on
it
this
says so in the article.
Yeah.
Conservatives concerned about the death penalty said that a lot of the folks who signed this clemency letter might have given pause about signing on a letter opposing the death penalty generally, but they think we have no business executing Scott Panetti. And I think that's that's kind of the to me the article was kind of going there with it, that there you have people from different backgrounds,
right?
The anti-death penalty and the if you say pro-death penalty, but then coming together on this particular case, so that we can find agreement on that. Now, I happen to be different than I believe that the death penalty is something that God gave the society, gave Caesar for use. He established two different institutions, the institution of the church, the institution of the state, and the state was given the sword, and the church was given the sword of the Spirit, which are two different functions. And that, one is to be used, the state is to use the sword to protect the innocent and to punish the wicked. And so that is, a biblical position, I guess you could say, on that, on interpretation of Scripture.
But you understand the struggle that many people
very much so.
Yeah, so.
And of course that has to be used under the authority of God. And because, when that person is executed, that's not the end of the story. It may be on this side of life, but on the other side of life, the story continues because they go into eternity and into the,
right.
And what
God's
comes
grace
after
whatever.
that.
Yeah. But Johnny, as someone I know that studies a lot of first century Christianity, Judaism, and its interplay there too. I mean, we have the story of the Jews taking Jesus to Pilate because they didn't have a law. They couldn't execute him. under their law. They needed the state to do it.
Yeah, they had to have.
Well, that had been taken away from them.
Oh, excuse
Sorry.
me. I got a little feedback there. Go ahead.
Yeah, that had been taken away from them by the Roman occupation. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think I would add to this is that way back in in Deuteronomy, when we look at Deuteronomy, we see where God. I mean, there are obviously some places like there are places that it's kind of strange to us, but if your child is a drunk and a problem, you can take him out of the Times Square and stone him to death. So that's kind of weird. But then there's a specific passage about getting a judge, someone to act as judge, or
Right.
like a Levite or a priest, and with a couple of witnesses, and you witness and you have a trial. And if a person has sinned against God and against people, then they need forgiveness, and if they refuse that, and if they just don't accept what's been given to them to do as punishment, then they are to be they will die. The word doesn't say you will kill them; it says they will die, and so that speaks about not going the way of life. So, and then further on down into the New Testament, Jesus goes back to that and says, okay, we're going to do the same kind of thing. We're going to need a couple of witnesses if one of you among you sins, and you go with witnesses. And if they completely disagree and they just won't do it, then you just forgive them 70 times 7. Mm-hmm. There is no point where they will die. And then Paul is clear. I mean, Paul even goes on to add in Ephesians 6:12, and he says, we're not fighting against people. We're fighting against darkness and principalities. I mean, we're putting people to death for stuff that, in many ways, their own madness gives them no ability to be better judges of, and they make poor decisions. And okay, fine. I mean, if we want to put people to death, that's part of our national policy. Fine, but I don't think it's a good Christian policy.
Okay. Well, again, this article brings that out. As I said, though, this is the kind of the easy one to decide because of the nature of this.
We have empathy.
The nature of this particular individual. It becomes a little bit more problematic, I think, when you have somebody who is maybe borderline there, or is completely understands the difference of right and wrong. So it's for another day and another time, but this one, again, is bringing up that issue of the death penalty once again. And so we thank you for joining us today on Faith Matters on the talk station, FM 107 and AM 1240. And as we said, you can contact us by email, faithmatters@thetalkstation.com. You can find us on Facebook, Faith Matters, all as one
Thank you
word.
for joining us for Faith Matters. Email your comments, questions, and suggestions to faithmatters@thetalkstation.com.
Give me faith, trust what you say, that you're good and your love is great. I'm broken inside, I give you my life. Give me faith.
Faith Matters is a production of The Talk Station.